History loves turning generals into statues. Brave jaw, serious eyes, dramatic horse, convenient. Because behind the bronze and marble, many of them were absolute walking disasters. Some talked to ghosts, some fought with swords in World War II, some kept chickens, drank corpse brandy, or lost wars to rabbits. So here are 32 of the weirdest facts about history's most famous generals. 1. You may know Gebhard von Blücher as the Prussian field marshal who helped smash Napoleon at Waterloo. But in his final years, his mind staged a full retreat without asking permission. This ferocious old commander developed a delusion so oddly specific it sounds like a rejected scene from a surreal comedy. He became convinced that a French soldier had somehow made him pregnant, and that he was going to give birth to a baby elephant. Picture the doctors trying to discuss symptoms like serious professionals while one of Europe's most feared soldiers is panicking about an incoming elephant delivery. The man had survived campaigns, cavalry charges, and Napoleon himself, only to spend his last days terrified of an imaginary pachyderm maternity ward. History is polite enough to call it decline. Everyone else calls it deeply weird. 2. Stonewall Jackson is remembered as one of the sharpest tactical minds of the American Civil War. But in person, he often behaved like a human being assembled from confusing instructions. During battle, he was known to ride with one arm held awkwardly in the air, and no, it was not some heroic salute. Jackson believed one side of his body was heavier than the other, so raising his arm helped balance his blood and stop him from tipping over like a badly packed suitcase. As if that were not enough, he had a famous obsession with lemons. So while bullets were flying and men were screaming, Jackson could be seen calmly sucking on lemons like a battlefield stress toy, apparently more concerned about blood distribution than incoming artillery. Tactical genius? Absolutely. Normal breakfast companion? Not even close. 3. Admiral Horatio Nelson is Britain's immortal naval icon, proudly towering over London from his column, but the trip home after Trafalgar was less heroic statue and more maritime horror story. After Nelson was killed in battle, the crew needed to preserve his body for the long voyage back to England. Since nobody had a handy freezer on board, the ship's surgeon placed the admiral's corpse inside a large cask of brandy. So yes, Britain's greatest naval hero was basically pickled for transport. Then the legend gets even nastier. When the ship reached Britain, the cask was supposedly nearly dry, and rumor claimed sailors had secretly tapped it and drunk the alcohol through makeshift straws. Whether fully true or not, the nickname stuck. Navy rum became known as Nelson's blood. Congratulations, history. You invented the world's most cursed cocktail. 4. In medieval warfare, losing one eye would be a perfectly reasonable moment to retire, buy a cottage, and stop standing near sharp objects. Jan Žižka, the legendary Czech general, apparently missed that memo completely. He began his career with only one working eye, which is already military command on nightmare difficulty, and later went completely blind. Most people in that situation would have trouble finding the door. Žižka kept directing armies. He relied on sound, battlefield reports, and assistants describing the chaos around him, then built the fight inside his head like some terrifying medieval strategy game. The truly ridiculous part is that blindness did not ruin his record. Even after losing his sight entirely, he kept winning and repeatedly crushed forces of the Holy Roman Empire. The man literally could not see the enemy, and the enemy still had a worse day. 5. Robert E. Lee is usually presented as the stern, stone-faced commander of the Confederate Army, all dignity, discipline, and tragic oil-painting energy. But hidden behind that marble image was one deeply unexpected friendship, a chicken named Nellie. During the Civil War, Lee kept this pet hen in his tent, where she wandered around camp like a tiny feathered staff officer. She was not emergency soup. She was his favorite companion and even laid eggs under his cot in the morning, which is honestly better service than most wartime logistics departments. Lee was so attached to her that when Nellie disappeared during a retreat, he reportedly paused operations to search for her. Imagine exhausted soldiers waiting to march while their commander is out there looking for one missing hen. In the middle of a brutal war, this is weirdly adorable and completely absurd. 6. Subutai was one of the greatest military minds of the Mongol Empire, the strategist behind many of Genghis Khan's most devastating campaigns. But by the end of his life, the terrifying master of mobile warfare had one very awkward problem. He himself was not mobile. Subutai became so enormously heavy that he could no longer ride a horse, which is a small issue when your entire civilization is basically built around horses. While Mongol armies were famous for moving, like lightning across continents, their supreme commander had to be transported in a reinforced wagon or carriage pulled by multiple animals. And yet, this did not stop him. He planned and directed dozens of major battles, crushed powerful armies, and helped conquer staggering amounts of territory. Subutai proved that cardio is optional if your strategic brain is terrifying enough. 7. World War II was fought with tanks, aircraft, machine guns, radar, and industrial-scale destruction. Then there was Mad Jack Churchill, a British officer who looked at modern warfare and decided it needed more medieval theater. He went into battle carrying a Scottish broadsword, a longbow, and bagpipes, because apparently grenades were not dramatic enough. Churchill famously said that any officer who entered action without his sword was improperly dressed, as if the battlefield had a formal dress code. And he was not just posing for a bizarre military portrait. In 1940, he reportedly killed a German soldier with a longbow arrow, one of the strangest confirmed throwbacks in modern war. While everyone else was dodging bombs, Mad Jack was turning the Second World War into a live-action medieval fantasy campaign, and somehow he survived to complain the war ended too early. 8. Frederick William I of Prussia, the so-called Soldier King, had an obsession with tall men that went far beyond normal military recruitment. He created a special regiment called the Potsdam Giants, where the main qualification was not bravery, skill, or discipline. It was height. If you were over 6 feet tall, congratulations, you had become collectible. The king bought tall men from abroad, traded expensive gifts for them, and allegedly even had unusually tall men kidnapped so they could be added to his human display cabinet. He also tried to arrange marriages between tall soldiers and tall women in hopes of producing even taller children, because apparently he wanted an army and a breeding program. The funniest part is that he loved his giants so much, he rarely risked them in combat. They were less soldiers than extremely expensive action figures. 9. Union General Dan Sickles had a talent for turning every personal disaster into public theater. At Gettysburg, a cannonball mangled his leg so badly that doctors had to amputate it. For most people, that would be a horrific injury and maybe a quiet private trauma. Sickles treated it like a branding opportunity. Instead of burying the limb, he had the bones preserved and donated them to a medical museum in Washington. Then, for decades, he visited them on the anniversary of the amputation, like a man dropping by to see an old roommate who had moved out below the knee. He even brought guests along to view the remains of his former leg. Few generals have ever maintained such an emotionally complicated relationship with their own skeleton. Sickles did not just lose a limb, he turned it into a social event. 10. Alexander Suvorov was a legendary Russian commander who never lost a battle. But if you met him casually, you might assume he had escaped from the strangest military monastery in Europe. He hated luxury and refused to sleep in proper beds, even when staying in palaces. Give him a comfortable mattress, and he would rather curl up on hay like a deeply opinionated goat. His wake-up routine was even better. Suvorov did not rely on drums, bugles, or junior officers to rouse the troops. He did it personally. At dawn, the great commander would run around camp flapping his arms and crowing like a rooster. Imagine being half asleep, freezing and miserable, only to find your commander screaming bird noises at your face. Completely ridiculous? Yes. Effective? Somehow. Also, yes. The man was chaos with a flawless win record. 11. The ancient Chinese warlord. Cao Cao took discipline seriously, sometimes too seriously for his own comfort. He once issued a strict rule that any soldier whose horse trampled a farmer's wheat field would be punished by death. No excuses, no exceptions, very dramatic leadership energy. Then, almost immediately, Cao Cao's own horse bolted straight into a wheat field and flattened the crops. Awkward. By his own law, he now technically owed everyone one dead Cao Cao. His advisors begged him not to execute himself, mainly because replacing the boss is difficult during a campaign. So Cao Cao produced a spectacular loophole. He declared that hair represented the head, cut off a chunk of his own hair, and presented it as a symbolic beheading. Justice apparently had been served. It remains one of history's greatest examples of technically correct nonsense. 12. Mark Antony was a Roman general, political heavyweight, Cleopatra's lover, and a man who clearly believed subtlety was for peasants. While other powerful men rode horses or rolled through Rome in elegant chariots, Antony allegedly decided that ordinary horsepower was too boring. He wanted lion power. Ancient sources claim he rode through the streets in a chariot pulled by actual lions, because nothing says stable leadership like turning traffic into a zoo emergency. It was meant to show that he was strong enough to command nature itself, but for regular pedestrians it probably communicated something closer to, "Please do not eat me, Mr. Politician." Imagine trying to buy bread, and suddenly a half-drunk Roman celebrity roars past behind two giant predators. Antony wanted to look like the alpha male of Rome. He mostly looked like a public safety violation. 13. Winfield Scott was a giant figure in American military history, serving from the War of 1812 all the way to the opening of the Civil War. By the end, unfortunately, giant figure had become less metaphor and more engineering problem. Scott enjoyed fine food and grand living, and his body eventually reached a size that made ordinary military movement deeply complicated. When the Civil War began, he was so heavy that mounting a horse was no longer a simple human activity. His staff reportedly needed a special hoisting system to lift the commanding general onto his saddle, like they were loading cargo onto a ship. Nothing says battlefield intimidation quite like watching your army's top officer being slowly craned into position before the fighting starts. Scott had enormous experience, enormous authority, and, apparently, enormous logistical requirements. 14. Union General Benjamin Butler hated Confederate President Jefferson Davis with the kind of intensity that makes normal insults feel lazy. When Butler controlled New Orleans, where Davis had once lived, he decided to turn political hatred into bathroom design. He ordered custom china wash basins, urinals, and chamber pots decorated with Jefferson Davis's face, placed exactly where users could show their opinions several times a day. This was not subtle propaganda. This was porcelain-powered psychological warfare. Butler basically spent serious money so soldiers and civilians could disrespect the Confederate leader with maximum bodily efficiency. It is one thing to defeat your enemy in battle. It is another to mass-produce restroom equipment that lets people insult him every morning after coffee. Petty? Absolutely. Expensive? Yes. Historically memorable? Unfortunately for everyone's dignity, also yes. 15. Zhang Zongchang, the Chinese warlord known as the Dog Meat General, belongs in the Museum of Rulers who made reality feel drunk. In the 1920s, he controlled his territory with the energy of a man randomly pressing buttons in a strategy game. He famously claimed he did not know how much money he had, how many soldiers served him, or how many wives were in his household. Those are not minor details. Those are basically the dashboard of your life. But his greatest moment of deranged leadership came during bad weather. After a severe drought, rain finally arrived, but it ruined his military plans. Zhang took this personally. He ordered artillery dragged outside and had his men fire cannons at the sky to punish heaven. Yes, he declared war on rain, not metaphorically, with actual cannons. 16. Antonio López de Santa Anna, Mexican general and dictator, possessed the kind of ego that needed its own parade permit. During a battle against the French, he lost a leg to cannon fire, which is undeniably dramatic. But Santa Anna did not simply mourn the missing limb and move on like a normal person with other national problems. Years later, he had the preserved leg dug up and given a full state funeral. We are talking military honors, speeches, prayers, cannon salutes, and public mourning for what was essentially one retired body part. A country was expected to stand respectfully while an old foot received treatment normally reserved for heroes. Santa Anna turned his own amputation into national theater, proving that for dictators, even the leftovers of their anatomy can become sacred government property. 17. Lord Kitchener looked like the human version of an imperial warning label. Huge mustache, severe stare, famous recruitment posters, the whole "I personally disapprove of your weakness" package. But behind the terrifying image, he had a surprisingly cozy obsession: knitting. Kitchener did not just enjoy it quietly as a relaxing hobby. He promoted it like a battlefield necessity. He was associated with a seamless sock finishing technique known as the Kitchener stitch, and he encouraged proper knitted socks because good footwear could help soldiers avoid miserable foot problems in the trenches. The mental image is priceless. One of the most intimidating men in the British Empire, sitting with needles in hand, aggressively producing warm socks while planning military operations. Some generals sharpened swords. Kitchener sharpened knitting needles. Honestly, the socks were probably more useful than half the strategies. 18. Ulysses S. Grant built his reputation as the relentless Union general who ground down Confederate armies and accepted brutal casualties when he believed victory required it. His enemies called him the Butcher, which sounds like a man who could casually eat steak off a battlefield map. But in private, Grant had a severe problem with blood. He reportedly hated the sight of it so much that even meat cooked too rare could make him sick. If a steak arrived with red juices or a suspicious pink center, he wanted nothing to do with it. He preferred his meat cooked until it was nearly carbonized, the culinary equivalent of surrendering to fire. The paradox is wild. Grant could endure the horror of war, but a slightly undercooked dinner was where his nerves drew the line. 19. Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte had one of history's strangest career arcs. He began as a French revolutionary soldier fighting in an age that wanted kings removed from the menu, then somehow ended up becoming King of Sweden. That is not a promotion. That is a plot twist with a crown. According to a famous legend, Bernadotte carried an extremely awkward secret under his royal clothing. He was supposedly reluctant to undress in front of doctors or servants, and after his death, people claim they discovered an old tattoo from his revolutionary youth reading "Death to Kings." Whether the story is legend or fact, the irony is too delicious to ignore. Imagine sitting on a throne while your own chest is basically calling for your resignation by execution. Bernadotte may have become royalty, but his skin allegedly never updated its political platform. 20. Pyrrhus of Epirus was a brilliant commander who terrified Rome and gave history the phrase Pyrrhic victory, meaning a win so expensive it feels like losing with better paperwork. With a reputation like that, you would expect him to die in some enormous heroic duel, surrounded by fire, banners, and dramatic speeches. Instead, he was stopped by roofing material. During a street fight in Argos, Pyrrhus became tangled in combat below while an elderly woman watched from a rooftop. Seeing him threaten her son, she grabbed a heavy roof tile and threw it down. The tile struck Pyrrhus in the neck, stunning or paralyzing him, and he was killed soon after. The man who challenged empires was ultimately defeated by an angry mother with good aim and spare construction supplies. Ancient history rarely gets more humiliating. 21. Giuseppe Garibaldi is the revolutionary hero who helped unite Italy, and his fighters became famous for their bright red shirts. The romantic version says the color represented passion, sacrifice, and a willingness to bleed for freedom. Very inspiring. The practical version sounds more like discount shopping. Garibaldi's men wore red largely because he found a cheap supply of red tunics in South America, reportedly intended for workers such as butchers, where bloodstains would be less noticeable. In other words, one of the most iconic looks in revolutionary history may have started as budget slaughterhouse fashion. It was not a carefully designed national brand. It was, "These are available, affordable, and already red, so congratulations, we have uniforms." Italy's legendary revolutionary style came from the clearance rack, and somehow it still looked heroic. 22. Napoleon Bonaparte defeated coalitions, terrified monarchs, reorganized Europe, and built one of history's most famous military legends. Then rabbits happened. To celebrate a treaty, his chief of staff arranged a rabbit hunt and collected hundreds of rabbits for the emperor's entertainment. Unfortunately, the rabbits were not wild. They were tame domestic animals, and when released, they did not flee from Napoleon like conquered Europe. They charged toward him because they assumed this small, intense man was there to feed them. Soon the emperor was swarmed by hungry fluff, with rabbits climbing his legs and jacket in a soft, ridiculous wave of appetite. Napoleon, conqueror of armies, had to retreat to his carriage under pressure from adorable livestock. He could handle Austria, Prussia, and Russia for a while. But weaponized cuddling, that was apparently a problem. 23. Dictators. Stealing money is not exactly breaking news, but Francisco Franco managed to make corruption look like a miracle of probability. Spain's massive national lottery, El Gordo, once produced a winner so convenient it almost becomes comedy, the Generalissimo himself. Now, in theory, any citizen can win the lottery. In practice, when the absolute ruler of the country somehow lands the biggest prize, people start raising eyebrows high enough to require medical attention. Many suspected that the real winning ticket was found and taken, or that officials were pressured to announce Franco's number regardless of what actually happened. Either way, the message was clear. Under dictatorship, even luck may need government approval. Why rob a bank when you can simply order fortune itself to report for duty? 24. British General Adrian Carton de Wyatt was so hard to kill that reality seemed to get bored trying. Across his career, he was shot in the face, head, stomach, ankle, leg, hip, and ear. He survived plane crashes, escaped from captivity, and lost an eye and a hand along the way. At one point, when a doctor refused to amputate damaged fingers, he reportedly bit them off himself because apparently waiting for medical paperwork was too soft. By the end, he looked less like a general and more like a war monument that had learned to walk. And after enduring this catalog of horrors, he famously said he had enjoyed the war. Most people enjoy gardening, music, or a pleasant walk. Carton de Wyatt apparently enjoyed being used as target practice by the 20th century. 25. George Patton was one of the most aggressive Allied commanders of World War II, but inside his own head, he was living in a much larger historical franchise. Patton sincerely believed in reincarnation and thought he had been a warrior in previous lives across many ancient and modern battlefields. He claimed he had fought with Roman soldiers, marched in older European wars, and stood in conflicts long before anyone called him George. When visiting ancient sites, he sometimes behaved as if he remembered them personally, pointing out where camps had stood because, in his mind, he had actually been there. For Patton, World War II was not just another command assignment. It was the newest season of a military career he believed had been running for centuries. Most generals study history. Patton seemed convinced he was history's returning guest star. 26. Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, dominated Roman politics, seduced Cleopatra, and reshaped the future of the Western world. Yet for all that power, he was deeply bothered by one enemy he could not defeat: his own hairline. Caesar was famously insecure about going bald, which is both very human and extremely funny when the man in question is basically holding Rome by the throat. Ancient writers claimed he combed his thinning hair forward to cover the damage, creating a very early version of the desperate comb-over. His favorite accessory, the laurel wreath, helped even more. Officially, it symbolized victory and authority. Unofficially, it also worked as a prestigious leaf-based camouflage system for a shiny scalp. So one of Rome's most iconic symbols of power may also have been history's fanciest baldness cover-up. 27. Mithridates VI, king of Pontus, was so afraid of being poisoned that he turned paranoia into a daily wellness routine. He spent years taking tiny doses of various poisons, slowly training his body to tolerate them in a practice now called Mithridatism. It sounds clever until you realize he accidentally solved a problem he later desperately needed. After losing to Rome and facing capture, Mithridates decided to kill himself with poison. He drank a lethal dose and waited for the dramatic end. Nothing happened. His body had become too resistant. He was, in the most inconvenient way possible, suffering from success. Instead of a quick death, he had to ask a guard to finish the job with a sword. Imagine optimizing your immune system so well that your own suicide plan fails. That is not strategy. That is tragic irony with chemistry. 28. Baron Roman von Ungern-Sternberg was not called the Mad Baron because he had quirky hobbies and collected stamps. During the Russian Civil War, he led forces into Mongolia and built a reputation so terrifying that even hardened soldiers thought he seemed less like a commander and more like a cursed folktale wearing a uniform. He embraced a violent, mystical worldview, became obsessed with Buddhism in a distorted and brutal form, and reportedly imagined himself as a reincarnation of Genghis Khan sent to cleanse the world. He consulted fortune tellers, ruled through terror, and treated cruelty as if it were a governing philosophy. In an era already overflowing with chaos, Ungern-Sternberg still managed to stand out as unusually nightmarish. He was basically a medieval warlord who wandered into the 20th century and refused to update his software. 29. Simon Bolivar, the Liberator, helped free huge parts of South America from Spanish rule and became one of the most important figures in the history of the continent. Nations, cities, and currencies would later carry his name. But his own final days were shockingly bleak. Bolivar had spent or lost much of his personal fortune in the revolutionary struggle, pouring resources into the cause until the hero of independence was left almost penniless. By the time he died, the situation was so grim that those preparing his body reportedly realized he did not even own a decent shirt for burial. They had to borrow one from a neighbor to dress the corpse of the man who had helped create nations. It is brutal historical irony. Bolivar gave millions a political future, but could not afford proper funeral clothing for himself. 30. Georgy Zhukov is remembered as the iron-faced Soviet marshal who helped crush Nazi Germany and take Berlin. But behind that granite image was a secret weakness for the most American drink imaginable: Coca-Cola. After encountering the soda through contacts like Eisenhower, Zhukov reportedly loved it. The problem was that openly enjoying capitalist sugar water in Stalin's Soviet Union was not exactly a career-enhancing move. So he asked for a special version. Coca-Cola produced a clear, colorless batch with the caramel coloring removed, bottled in plain glass with caps designed to resemble vodka packaging. To outside observers, Zhukov looked like a tough Soviet hero knocking back spirits. In reality, he was enjoying fizzy American sweetness disguised as patriotic alcohol. It may be the strangest Cold War compromise ever: imperialist soda wearing a fake vodka costume. 31. Benedict Arnold became the most infamous traitor in American history, but before the betrayal, he was also a genuinely talented commander who fought bravely at Saratoga. The United States eventually found a way to honor his battlefield contribution while pretending the rest of the man did not exist. At Saratoga National Historical Park stands the famous Boot Monument, dedicated to the wounded leg of the brilliant officer injured there in 1777. The monument praises the sacrifice and rank, but carefully avoids saying Arnold's name. That is not an accident. It is historical shade carved in stone. America basically said, "That leg did excellent work, but the person attached to it later became a disaster. So we will commemorate the boot and leave the traitor out of it." It is the most passive-aggressive monument in military history. 32. Field Marshal Douglas Haig projected the image of a stern, rational British commander during World War I, the kind of man who seemed made entirely of discipline, mustache, and grim paperwork. But behind the official seriousness, his private beliefs reportedly wandered into much stranger territory. Haig had an interest in spiritualism and was said to take seances seriously, believing communication with the dead could offer guidance. Some accounts even connect him with the idea of receiving advice from great commanders of the past, including Napoleon. Imagine being a soldier in the mud of the Western Front and learning that the next offensive may not be coming from intelligence reports, but from a conversation with a dead French emperor. It turns military strategy into something uncomfortably close to haunted management consulting. Now be honest, which general here was the most unhinged, and which legendary maniac did we criminally leave out? Drop the name in the comments, and if your pick is weird enough, it may deserve a future video. Like the video if at least one of these stories made you question how history ever survived its own commanders. And subscribe for more bizarre history that textbooks were too embarrassed to explain.